So, welcome everybody to our session on Towards a New Enlightenment. I'm Markus Gabriel, Academic Director at the New Institute in Hamburg. We will also briefly introduce our institution as we delve deeper into its constitutional document. Then right next to me is Gerd Skobel, a philosopher, interdisciplinary thinker with a focus on issues having to do with complexity, and among other things also a famous journalist, one of those who has his own TV show named after him. So Skobel, both the person and the TV show. And then next to him, Andre Zwitter. He's a political scientist, social scientist, and program chair at our institute, the New Institute, where he runs a terrific program on how to reformulate the Sustainable Development Goals so as to tweak them into possibly flourishing development goals. That is a different way of thinking about what it is for humans to successfully develop. And he's running this with a group of exciting fellows, amongst them Kamaura, one of the intellectual architects of the Gross National Happiness Index in Bhutan, Vakani Hoffman, an activist and thinker from Africa, I forgot which country, and who else is already with us? Ariel Hernandez, who works on the issue of care, and some other thinkers who will be incoming over our term. So that's the panel. And I will briefly start us off with some conceptions having to do with what we call the New Enlightenment, about which we published this discussion paper, which was the result of our first fellowship year, a collaborative exercise in a particular new type of the humanities, which we call future-oriented humanities. So let me give you a little context, and then I'll bring my two colleagues in from the angle which I assume they will occupy most likely, and then they will most likely reject that ascription and describe their own positionality in their own terms. So the basic idea of this paper is to react to what we call nested crises. So our diagnosis of the present moment is not that of the polycrisis, which is a famous term to think about what's happening right now. And the idea of the polycrisis would be one where we say there's one single, as it were, overarching mega crisis, which is kind of a superposition, as it were, right, of the different single crises. Geopolitical crisis, energy crisis, climate crisis, crisis of democracy, and so forth at your favorite crisis, right? Hunger, gender, I don't even know where to begin and where to end. And if you think of all of those crises as adding up to like one mega crisis, then you think we're in the polycrisis. That would be one way of thinking about the present moment. Another one would be to say we're in multiple crises. There are just many crises, right? That's a different diagnosis where you think that, well, they kind of don't add up. Some of them are bigger. Maybe you think the climate crisis is the biggest one, or, over the last couple of weeks, one might rather tend to be inclined to think that the war is the biggest one, right? Whatever you think is the biggest one, but you might think there are just multiple crises of different scale. Now, what we argue for, and then I will get to the New Enlightenment, is a different conception where we think of all of those crises as intertwined and embedded in mutually increasing vicious circles of causal detrimental effects. So what this means is you look at one crisis, and then you will see that some of the other crises feed into the dynamics of this crisis in complex ways, never in a monocausal way. For instance, very trivial example, right? We both find climate change and wars of aggression undesirable for good reasons, right? Both should not take place. But they do hang together. So even fighting aggressors in wars of aggression or defending your nation state against otherwise unacceptable attacks, as is the case in Israel right now, right, has obvious ecological costs. But we would never argue that the Ukraine should not defend themselves or Israel should not defend itself because of the CO2 emissions of war, right? That would be a truly absurd position to take. That would not be, like, let me put it like this, a great solution to the problem. Now, but you see how all of this hangs together. Or think about the, Russian war of aggression, which to some extent hangs together, is not monocausally caused by, but hangs together with the necessary energy transition, say, within the European Union. So Russia is losing some of its business model, is independently interested in imperial activity, and there you see how one crisis influences the other, right? And so now you can draw, if you start with any crisis, you can draw diagrams, and you will see that crises are nested within crises, are nested within crises, and this sets up to a maximally complex system. Now, our idea of a new Enlightenment is to develop conceptual tools from the humanities, social sciences, arts, activism, politics, and other sectors of society to develop concrete solutions for some crises, and then we try to scale them up for other crises. And we call that project a new Enlightenment. One of the reasons why we choose the term Enlightenment for this is paradoxically, as some of you might think, that the term the new Enlightenment did precisely not originate under so-called Eurocentric conditions. The term, roughly as we use it, was coined by Chinese and Japanese contemporary philosophers. It then occurred in various African contexts as a term of debate. And there the idea was that we need a new mode of cooperation that does precisely not rely on the idea of a stable human nature. So it's not the case that there just is human being and human being is confronted with crises, so we just need to understand human being and develop technocratic, expatocratic solutions. That was the idea of the old Enlightenment. Figure out the mathematics of the universe, get the right technology, a little model of democratic governance, division of labor, etc., repress the others by colonial activity, export that model, and everything will be fine. That's kind of the old Enlightenment, simply reconstruct. The new Enlightenment is based on a different conception, which we call human co-becoming, with reference to the Japanese contemporary philosophers Takahiro Nakajima's work. In contemporary Chinese, the term is gongsheng, in Japanese kyosei, which is the translation of the term symbiosis into Japanese-Chinese characters. It means co-becoming, doing something together, under conditions which allow for a new universal to arise, something that humans share that is not grounded in an idea of what we all already have in common. So that's the prospect, and what we try to do with our institute is to create an institution and programs that deliver on this promise. So how can we bring different sectors of society together, international global thinkers from different disciplines, but also practitioners, so as to specify this broad idea into very concrete programs. So that's basically what we try to do with this idea. And thereby we try to put the humanities on a road we call future-oriented humanities, where future-oriented humanities are not just attempts to anticipate the future, let alone predict it under conditions of complexity, which is impossible. One definition of complexity means that the complex unfolding of a system is precisely not fully predictable. Our idea is that we can nevertheless engage in future making on the basis of value judgment that's grounded in the humanities. So we want to make the world a better place, simply put, but we want to ground that not in mere activism for the perception of the right cause, right? We know what the right cause is, let's just be activists for it, but we want to identify both what the right cause is by engaged humanistic social scientific investigation, and then respond to it at the right level. And social activism is one level at which you can engage with crises, but there are other ways of dealing with crises. Sometimes it's just ordinary, dirty, liberal democratic work of, catering for compromises. At other times it's a media strategy, whatever it takes. So that's roughly the idea. And now let me bring in my colleagues. So first, Andre Zwitter will say something from also a standpoint of a political scientist, someone who's like deeply worried and thinking about the geopolitical situation from his perspective, and also someone who has designed his own concept for all of this meta science. So he will, bring his ideas to the table than Gerd Skobel, who has been a major influence on us with his thinking about complexity, will add the debate, and once we all either agree or disagree, or it will get complex, then we open this up for a conversation with all of you, of course.
Thank you, Markus. So I think one point that you brought forward, a geopolitical problem that we have in Europe and abroad, is something that we are deeply worried about. And the whole idea of the new Enlightenment is to help transform these decisions and these situations. But as a political scientist, but also as a former lawyer, we have an expression, the normative power of the factual. How do facts actually enact norms? How do they establish what can and can we not do? Now, with the nested crisis that you described, one thing, of course, becomes immediately pertinent. We are facing impending doom. We are facing an Armageddon when all these nested crises come together. They will multiply each other, and they will accelerate and further lead us to a downward spiral. I have another worry to add, one that is not mentioned, and one that strikes as much fear into me as the crisis that you've described. And that worry is human ingenuity. You know the expression that desperate times justify desperate measures. And somewhere in the text you write, geoengineering is already considered as a path forward. My fear that comes cropping up very quickly is that we as humans are ready to do whatever it takes to survive. Not to survive for the sake of taking forward the principles of new enlightenment, the principles of compassion, if you may, but to take forward the status quo. We've seen that with Corona. We've all hoped for a new beginning. What we got was the status quo ante. We are back at where we started. Now, this human ingenuity might lead us to darken the skies. There is debates on using silver particles to reflect sunlight in order to decrease the effects of UV rays. But are we willing to take with us the whole Earth just because we can't be happy? Now, this is a very fundamental crisis that we are then facing, because it is paired with other problems. It is paired not only with a desperation that our contemporary status quo is vanishing, but it is paired with what Carl Gustav Jung described in Modern Man in Search for a Soul, that we can no longer rest on the metaphysical certainties of our medieval brothers. With other words, not only are we faced with an end in our lives, our children might face a disastrous future, but we can also not hope for anything that is aching towards heaven. So this crisis is in and of itself also a crisis of meaning. It is a crisis that is so fundamental that it is a driving force to a desperation that can lead to disastrous effects that we cannot yet foresee, the effects produced by human ingenuity.
Well, thank you, Andre. Gerd, you want to jump in?
Well, the question of ethics, I think, which has to do with all these topics, is very easily put. The question is, how do we want to live together with other living beings? And that obviously is a question which is not in the discussion right now very much. It sort of failed to enter the discussion. So that's one remark I have to make. And that, of course, is a question which you have to think about internationally, globally, not just from a European or Western point of view. The second thing I would like to remark is that your concept of complexity or intertwined crises is not a new concept, really. Why? Because it has always been that way. If you think about ecological systems, what are they? Well, they are complex systems. They have a non-linear dynamic, and very often they develop in an unpredictable way. That's exactly what we have today with the intertwined crises. So the interesting thing is that what we observe on a phenomenological level is not new. However, for the first time, we think about it as being a complex problem, or rather a problem of complexity. And the science of complexity or complexity research is only, say, 50 years old, maybe even only 40. So that's one other remark. And then from the standpoint of philosophy, it's interesting that I think, well, I'd rather talk about me just personally now. My concept of reason, coming from, Frankfurt school and my basic philosophical training, was there's one reason for all. One reason fits all. That was the message. So reason has no time index. It's not dynamic. It's sort of static. And it's for black and white and whoever, men and women alike, or whoever uses reason, the very same thing. What is new with the new Enlightenment is to think reason dynamically, to think reason in the context of complexity. And that's my fourth remark. That leads me to another sort of topic, which when you utter it, sounds very esoteric. But I don't mean it in any sense esoteric, which is wisdom. What is wisdom? Wisdom is the solution, or I should rather say the sustainable solution of existential yet complex problems. If you want to solve complex problems which have an existential dimension, it's not enough to solve them just for now, just for this government, and who cares what's going to happen after I'm not elected anymore. So it's a sustainable way of thinking about it. And one of the political issues, I think, which has to do with it is if we live in a democracy which changes its basic ideas of how to deal with the intertwined crises every 4 or 5 years, we have a problem. Because if you think about, say, ecological problems, they are rather long-term, long-time developing problems. So we need both a short-time sort of democracy with a rather creative and new input, yes, so it's good to have elections every 4 years. On the other hand, we need a very sustainable long-term time scale thinking, and that's also part of the new Enlightenment.
Yeah, let me emphasize one dimension. I literally just had that discussion, so thanks for bringing this up this morning, with a journalist as we are preparing a panel on exactly that debate with Robert Habeck and Winfried Kretschmann, the governor of Baden-Württemberg. They're hosting an event on how to organize social cohesion in the upcoming days in Mannheim. And we literally had that debate, how, as a preparation for the panel, how is indeed the constitutive short-termism of democracy, which is not to be criticized because for independent reasons, I would still hold on to the idea that, what we call democratic governance, that there are reasons for why it works, right? And why it's objectively good. So we shouldn't criticize it just on the ground that ecological processes are long-term, right? So that just doesn't follow. Now, the question is then how to reconcile these two timescales. And we now know very clearly, also thanks to advances in paleoanthropology, etc., and even paleogenetics, that if you look at longue durée movements, which is crucial for thinking about climate change, etc., then you will see, of course, that the human animal is, like any other animal, in the business of adapting itself to its ecological niche. So what we are also trying to do, is one dimension of the new Enlightenment, is to think of us, right, in terms of that animality. So what is it therefore to think of democracy as a living system? So precisely not in terms of the citizen as a rational agent. So recently I've been advocating, for instance, for the children's vote on the ground that reasons for not giving children the vote are typically reasons that, say they're not yet rational, right? But, simple question, how many of those who are allowed to vote are rational, right? I mean, that's not a criterion. It's not that at the ballot they ask you like a question in complex number theory, right, or history of Germany. They don't ask you if you're an anti-Semite, right? You go in and you have a vote once you're 18. So, and the idea of, 18 has something to do with exactly that static notion of a reason. So what if we replace that with a more adequate conception of reason as part of the human animal's adaptation to its environment? I mean, that's the very point of reason, right? So it wouldn't be, there's some type of rationality in engaging in self-destruction. You can be more or less effective at it, right? Russia might be very effective at self-destruction, or so we hope right now. But that rationality is not what we like when we say reason, right? So there's this normative concept of reason where we praise something for being rational, reasonable, etc. But we want to think of that as a living system. So if we think of democracy as also something that's alive, then for instance, another proposal that we have recently been making in conversations with the Japanese philosopher Kohei Saito is to replace the concept of transformation, socio-ecological transformation, energy transformation, etc., by the concept of a metamorphosis. So imagine we thought of the contemporary technocratic measures that we need to take in our societies in order to fight, say, climate change, such as, replacing fossil-driven energies by some more sustainable ones. What if we thought of this not merely in terms of a technocratic transformation, but as a metamorphosis, as an activity that living beings engage in due to the necessity to adapt to the changes in their environment that they have produced. And all living beings do that, right? So one important thing about any ecological thinking is to realize that there is no such thing as the environment. The very concept of Umwelt in German, introduced by Johann Jakob von Uexküll, has it that there are different environments for different living beings. There is no single shared environment for all living beings. That just doesn't exist. That's the point of ecological thinking. Nature does not exist. It's the shortest summary of ecology. And that means that, we need to adapt to also complex systems. So that's one way of cashing this out. And we do not yet know, of course, nobody, what it would take. And therefore I hand over to you also, to think of democratic governance, including, the technocratic infrastructure, the administration, etc., in those terms. We have no clue what that would mean. It would also, among other things, mean to replace the language of physics, social physics, in a description of the organization of society by the language of the life sciences.
May I jump into reason? Because that is a wonderful term that we have, of course, not only borrowed, but taken over from the Enlightenment. The very foundation why we are all equal is because we are all capable, in principle, of reason. Now, when I explain that to my students, are we all equal? They look at me and say, well, yeah, of course, because that's the politically desired answer. And I said, well, look at each other. Do you look the same? No. Do you earn the same? No. Do you wear the same? No. We are not all equal, right? So what is it? It is reason that is the great unifier, on the one hand. But that has led to a technocratic worldview, because what allows reason to do, it allows to dissect life as a whole into small consecutive pieces that interact. What we start losing to see is what life as a whole means. Something that we can intuit, but something that we cannot rationally grasp. Now, what problem we have translated that into is that in modern bureaucracy, things that we can dissect, things that we can measure, are the things that we can govern and organize governance principles around. So when you look, for example, at the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals that are leading the nations towards 2030 into a sustainable development are 17 goals, split further into 169 indicators. Now, I challenge you to look up those indicators and tell me where in these indicators you will find love, compassion. Right. They are immeasurable, right? You recognize it, you see it, but love and compassion are in here, right? This is wisdom of the heart. It's not wisdom of the mind. Now, they are immeasurable, but they are not inactionable. They are actionable. If I go out of this stage and I hug any one of you, that's an action of compassion.
If I might add, you can even cultivate these things which seemingly are esoteric or ungraspable, but you can cultivate them. And there are various ways of doing that. I don't want to get into it. And then another remark to the sustainability goals. Obviously, any single one of them can be supported. Any single one of them is great. Yet when you look at them as a network of values, they're completely contradictory. And you have no idea how to realize them at the very same time. That's why most of the companies only jump on one or two, and they try to be strong in these sustainability goals, and they just forget about the others. Why? Because they can't do it at the very same time. So there's another expression for this seemingly contradictory way, which is complexity, I think. However, there is no theory of complexity because there are different complexities, different types or different forms or patterns of or dynamics of complexity. So we won't end in a new meta theory, the theory of everything. We won't do that because every theory is dynamic and it will change in time. But with complexity, we are much better, we are in a much better shape to grasp the real problem, which is the connected sort of network of problems. And compassion and love, and as I would call it, wisdom, because that's where it gets together, acting, thinking at the heart, is part of it.
And I would totally agree. Now, see, the problem that I see, and then I have to come back to realpolitik, realism, as it's termed in English. Realism will tell us, well, that sounds all lovely. And, an enlightened realism would say, it's in our self-interest to save the planet because that means we will also survive as individual states. But when it comes to the practicality of it, it really washes against this cliff like a wave and breaks apart. And how do we ensure compassion and wisdom and the enactment of those principles when it comes to making sure that other states behave the same as we do? Because we can't measure that. And when we can't measure that, bureaucracy shuts down.
Well, I think that's, one important dimension of the fact, which is not so often recognized even in democratic societies, that politics is, of course, not at all the same as the behavior of the state. The state is one representation of politics, not only in representative democracy, but that holds across any form of governance. So what we call the state is just one layer of the political. The political plays a role, anywhere where we are in the business of justifying the distribution of resources. So even like, walking on the street and passing by passers-by, and the whole sociology of it, the smile when you threaten to run into someone, or the anger that you get by other people, etc., all of this is kind of politics, right, by itself. So the political, and that should be a fundamental principle in particular of democracy and beyond, right? The political is something that not only has a top-down direction, which is the political as state action, but a bottom-up direction, which constitutes the nature of the top-down direction under any governance system. And the idea of democracy as a value system and not as a mere, electoral term bureaucracy, that idea, I think, is tied to a full recognition of the political as something that we enact, shape, and also can positively change in everyday action. For this reason, we all know, there's enough evidence for the fact that brutally authoritarian and worse regimes start on the, operative level of the family, for instance, right? We know how psychopathologies that turn someone into, like the Hamas, murderer, start somewhere, right, on a child level. That's one of the reasons why I'm always advocating for seriously bringing in the voice of the children, right? Just in the way in which we have learned that moral and human progress consists in bringing in voices, that is, representing human diversity on all scales of political organization, right? So that's a shape that progress takes. it's quite interesting how we haven't yet done this with the children. It's like a minor theme, remarkably, right? But any future society will depend on what happens to them. Yeah? So, and we know that, how psychopathologies, which then act out later in life if the wrong people are in political office, not naming names, though some are obvious, right, that they are generated in this particular way. That's why it's worthwhile reading a biography of Donald Trump, right? Not because it's independently interesting, but, the father plays a quite interesting role in the destruction of democracy. So had Donald Trump's father been, like a compassionate, nice, gender fluid, cool person from Manhattan, right, then maybe some other person would have been the Donald Trump, but at least not the guy with the orange hair. And I think that if we, those are dimensions of politics that we need to bring into the picture.
But you mentioned politics, and if I may grab the opportunity, the definition of politics very much depends on whether we want to bring our children in there. Because let me give you 3 definitions of politics that readily come to mind, right? The first one is the Aristotelian conception of politics that undoubtedly you are pursuing, right? That is, politics is a societal implementation of what he would have written for as an individual in his ethics, right? So politics is something of how can I be the best statesman for the greater good. Hans Morgenthau, he wrote that politics is really about managing something very specific in human nature, the will to dominate others, the animus dominandi. So political science is actually the science of the smallest evil. And now I'll give you the third definition, and I'll ask you where on this trajectory or on this continuum we are. The third definition from Clausewitz: war is politics with other means. In other words, politics is just the weaponless attempt of getting your way. Where do we want to bring our children in that space? How, and that is a transformative question, namely, how can we create a space of politics where that is a possibility?
May I add a fourth one, which would be Luhmann? Politics is the way to create sustainable decisions. That's where I would like to go.
Well, there's a sense in which I endorse a line of thinking in which I was, I think, quite influenced by Corinne Pellichon. She's one of the co-authors also of our paper, and she has written a terrific book, Nouvelle Lumière à l'âge du vivant, so the new enlightenment at the age of the living. And Corinne argues that indeed dimensions of compassion, cooperation, care, etc., those other dimensions of human life that are sometimes wrongly, as were merely associated with one dimension of gender, as it were the female, etc. But be that as it may, those issues have something to do with gender, but not in that particular way. So she points out that, this is also a dimension of politics. So if we think of politics primarily through the lens of war, struggle, vested interests, etc., right, say in the Hobbesian way, then we are prone to oversee the other dimension, right? Historically, early modern or later in modernity represented by people like Rousseau, right? And I think that both are right. We don't have to choose between these two views of human nature because both correspond to human experience. But I think we, if we bring in the idea of cooperation, then of course this would mean that those who are in power, right, those whose animus dominandi matters, should provide the conditions for care. So imagine political struggle would primarily be about how to best create conditions for care for each other, right? Then you would still have struggle, but the goal of the struggle and also the reward system would be one where you put the reward on who is best at solving a moral problem, right? That's in principle possible, and that was also an idea of the traditional Enlightenment. So maybe 2 closing statements by you, and then we open this up for a little round of discussion and conversation with everybody else who's here.
Well, nothing to add.
One small thing to add, the reward system, right? What is the reward? Because Thomas Jefferson's pursuit of happiness was inspired by John Locke's life, liberty, and the state. In other words, estate, property, was already an integral part of what makes happiness. And that was eventually translated into the pursuit of wealth as a wonderful measurement of whether you're happy or not. So the fundamental question will be, how will this reward system look like?
Absolutely. And we stop there, though I do have ideas and we could go on, etc. But they would lead into another, to a certain extent, provocative field. But we see, just rounding this up to, your comment, I think is quite an important one. Politics, of course, is intertwined in important ways with the world of business, entrepreneurial activity, and what we call the economy. And that is also a very important juncture, right? I'm not saying that it shouldn't be. It's quite important. Again, under any governance system, we need an economy. And everything I think that we have been saying also requires engaging in deep thinking about how to effect what we call in our program architecture at our institute, socioeconomic transformation. So how can we do that? And that means also rethinking precisely this link, the type of reward system. We will still have markets and money flows on all the models that we are pursuing intellectually, but again, they're governed by different qualitative measures, qualitative instead of mere quantitative growth, but that's just hinting at a shape of solution. And now let's open this up. One more word, like an adequate translation in a certain sense, though we are happy with Aufklärung, but like one way of translating it would be Erleuchtung, because in the Japanese-Chinese debate, they purposefully chose Enlightenment to have this meaning too, right? The new Enlightenment. There's a Buddhist sound involved in the English title, but not exclusively, right? So, but just mentioning this on a side note, that this is a virtue of the English meaning of enlightenment.
Which presupposes a different culture and a different form of cultivation, yes. Which I'm very much in favor of.
I know, so that's why I was also saying, it's like, there's a little, Asia here too. Okay, please, let's open this. Any questions on your end? I see already one. Should I share the microphone? I think we're recording for also a podcast that we will publish on the New Institute's homepage. Sorry, I didn't flag that. If that's okay with you, then yeah, there's a microphone. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Interesting that you bring up Buddhism. This question might go in a similar direction. You mentioned a conception of crises, multiple crises that are intertwined, interconnected, but still identifying them also in a way as separate, talking about them separately, right? So I was wondering whether if we want to tackle them, if we want to improve our situation, is there a sort of hierarchy of crises? Is it like, or should we tackle them from one angle or another? Should we start with one crisis and then there will be ripple effects throughout the other crises? Or is it more like different crises that are symptoms of an underlying cause, which is our conception of ourselves as human beings on this planet and the universe, and perhaps beyond, in a sense of codependent arising?
Well, thank you. Very pertinent question. Maybe you want to go first, and then I say something about my different ways of answering that very important question.
A very short answer would be that in a complex systems you have regimes of order, so you have a hierarchy, and you have other parts of the complex system which are out of order, chaotic, non-linear, no hierarchy. There's not one theory of solving, of getting a hierarchy of everything. So there is no hierarchy of chaos and order at the very same time. So in certain realms I would say yes, you have to act according to a hierarchy, not just of values but also of problems and solutions, yes. In other fields or areas or regimes, you can't you just can't do it.
Also, very briefly, I'm reminded of a humanitarian aid worker working in Haiti after the tsunami, and he said, "If everything's a priority, nothing is." And I think that's the situation that we're in. And the question is whether all those priorities can be averted at the same time, or how we as humanity want to live together regardless of what the crises are. Will they bring us closer together, or will they separate us?
I would also endorse a version of Gert's point that they are probably, depending on where you look, as it were, in the system or systems of nested crises. In different parts, you will have different strategies. So there will be hierarchical structure. Sometimes it will just be like a mere top-down bureaucratic thing, like a bad communication by the government or whatever. And then it's largely like, one unidirectional. Other parts are what Gerd described as chaotic, etc. So the tapestry, right, is such that you will have to have different solution spaces depending on the specific phenomenon you're dealing with. So the solution space will have to be as complex as the target system. So it's not the usual reduction of complexity strategy, it's increasing complexity. Right? So in a sense, the tools of the new Enlightenment have to be more complex than the crises. That's why we draw on the humanities as complexity producing disciplines, right? Reading a book from, a good history book makes things more complex, right? You just wanted to know what Napoleon did, right? And it's like, damn, right? It gets more complex. And this other book, at the end of the day, you're not quite sure if Napoleon even lived, right? After reading through all the Napoleon literature. And so that's a characteristic feature of the humanities. They, stop you from acting too quickly. As one of our fellows, the Nigerian poet and thinker Bayo Akomolafe once put it in a conversation, times are urgent, let's slow down. Right? So that's the type of attitude that we are proposing, right? So it's super urgent and complex, and one reaction is we need to find a solution, like quickly, now, something, Zeitenwende or whatever, right? And then everybody throws everything they always wanted to hear at Zeitenwende, though the idea was basically to get the military up and running, right? But we are like, yeah, cool, Zeitenwende or whatever, right? So, and that would be the wrong spirit. Now, so for this reason, complexity as an answer to complexity. But one more thing, that's more like a personal normative investment. So there I'm speaking kind of for like a vision that I have myself, an imaginary, is I believe that poverty needs to be solved first. One measure that I've been discussing recently with various business schools actually is that poverty should be illegal. I'm not saying we should sanction poor people. What I'm saying is that anything that anybody does that demonstrably leads to poverty should count as a crime. So imagine you look at a particular business model, you look at their accounts, it's just ordinary business investigation, and it turns out they're producing poverty somehow, directly or indirectly in their value chain, then this should count as much as a crime, as a negative externality sanctioned by state measures, as for instance their CO2 emission. Because I think that poverty is the major player, right? So I'm not saying make everybody wealthy, but poverty is a serious, extreme poverty is a serious human disease. It's studied by public health specialists in epidemiological terms, right? It's not hunger, it's not a thing that I have ever known in my life, poverty or real hunger, right? I know of them, I never experienced them. And I think that this is where a lot of the action is, because this in turn shapes a lot of the geopolitics, right? You need seriously poor peoples in order to create conditions for the type of geopolitics we are seeing. So I think that to a certain extent we need to hold the business world also responsible for that. Anybody who engages in poverty production, in my view, engages in a moral crime, which is not yet fully recognized as a legal crime. But that's just one vision, one way of thinking about, a major, as it were, move. More hands. Yes, please.
I have a question in the light of the book fair. What role does literature play in this whole process of rethinking? Because I have been reminded, you were talking about the crises and how they are intertwined, and I was reminded of the concept of Gérard Genette, who talks about the concept of intertextuality, that every text is not written by an author, but consists of every text and is connected to all the other texts in the world. And I was wondering if and how one could use this concept to maybe solve conflicts, crises like that.
May I take this one? Or sorry, no, or do you want to go first? Yeah. Thanks. Very inspirational point. I haven't connected those two yet. Though I love both dimensions, obviously. So thanks. I think that's a very helpful thought. So let me first endorse, as it were, the spirit of your question by saying that's kind of what we envision as humanities grounded crisis solution space, right? Looking at some of the best that the humanities have to offer, such as the work by Jeanette in general, right? And then everything that we have learned from intertextual literary theory, right? And now look at crises, of course, then with the tools that we have developed, tools of reading, right? Hermeneutic tools of reading, structural, post-structuralist, etc. All the tools that we have to think of reality as context, right? And I think this would be a very helpful way of thinking about precisely that, because the crises not only take place in socioeconomic material reality, it's not only that there are bombs and earthquakes and massacres, but there are also symbolic representations of them, contested sites in the symbolic order. And for those, we have precisely those tools of reading. And what if we applied them to the present moment, right? Not in the way, sorry for reminding us of that unfortunate event, not in the misguided way of most recent Slavoj Žižek, right? Who's doing this in spirit, right? But in a complex way. So what would it be to look at the present moment precisely from, with a certain distant analytical capacity that, those tools bring with them. So I would fully endorse that idea. I like it. So I will try it out. That's all I can say. I think it's a great, opening of a possible space. So basically, just thanks for that.
Whether he knows it or not, we are already trying it out together, and we are talking about stories. Storytelling, and literature plays a tremendously important part in there. Much of Sartre's philosophy was written as plays, because the best way to convey the unconveyable is through stories. So in our project itself, we have Wakani Hoffman, a Kenyan storyteller, collecting wisdom stories from all over the world. And why we want stories and literature specifically, but all forms of storytelling, is because they can tap into the intangibles, the immeasurables, without much words, without much ado, but you feel it instantly. There is another important component to that. This thought piece writes very importantly about the grand narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves about how important the economy is, how the economy should look like. Without a new narrative, without new stories, without literature to guide us towards these new ideas. And you don't have to read sci-fi literature to realize that what has been written so often comes to pass. But without those new narratives, without the stories, without the literature, the arts and the humanities, we are doomed. It's not the last of the luxuries that we need to finance for our taxpayers. It's the first of the necessities.
You want to say something?
Well, just one thought. I think one of the reasons why wisdom is excluded from the discourse right now is because you see how the different stories and contexts are linked. Because there is not just one language of wisdom. Obviously, the same sort of wisdom which always conveys something which is not conveyable, as you put it, can be narrated in various ways. And still, you're talking or acting in the same way.
And also one way of thinking about like literary competence, etc., right, in the present moment is not just related to the media in the manifold shape and the crises having to do with the media, but also the fact that, for instance, the type of terrorism that we're seeing, again, not just the massacres, but also the way in which terrorism reverberates in our storytelling. Right, so the stories that are available to us as individuals with different backgrounds, with different types of involvement, with respect to all those massacres, etc., those stories, right, are interwoven with other stories. And so imagine an audience, like a general public, which is trained in skillfuller readings of those narratives. And I think that would be one way, a humanistic way of fighting terrorism, right? A form of achieving a type of immunity, right? And that's not, that's a different type of struggle, and I think it's an important one. Back in the days when we think about, for instance, just a comparison of 9/11 to what happened in Israel, right? There we need to think about intertextuality. Also, how did, at the time, if we look back, what can we learn from discourse about 9/11, what Derrida, whatever, said back then, right? And the aftermath of 9/11, and what kind of templates for reading and understanding are available to us. And that's not avoiding political judgment. That's saying that this competency of reading is certainly better than, just immediately jumping to conclusions based on grabbing one's preferred narrative that's somehow out there. Yeah.
Tut's das? Ja. As a publisher, I want to add that the text is released under a Creative Commons license. It wants to be shared, it can be shared, and it's also published in HTML as open data. So feel free, and plus we brought some copies here today, so feel free to take your copies, to bring it home and work with it.
I hope I got your theory right. I'm just a student, so you're consequentialists, it seems like, and because your theory is very complex, because our world is very complex at the moment and has always been, but especially with all the problems we face right now, I wanted to ask, how would you confront the problem of overwhelmingness that always seems to appear when it comes to consequentialism, and especially when I think about making a structure like an ecosystem net for our crises. Where would you start? How would you try to put it in an order without making a very huge map, just to make the theory that in itself is very logic come into practice and be used for our problems and get into action?
Well, this is a really tough question. So you're not just a student. Nobody is, but this is a really good question. So I therefore hand over to, I will also say something, but maybe, I with a little help from my friends.
Very tough question, and obviously it has to do with the link between thinking or theory and acting. And thinking about Hannah Arendt, which you might like or not like, I personally would invest in understanding better what judgment is and how the connection between judgment and action works. And it's interesting that Kant's third critique, and I think Markus and me have a different opinion on that, has exactly that topic. What is Urteilskraft? What is the power or the faculty of judgment? So that would be my approach, and I don't have a general theory in order to answer your question. As we said, there are different spheres of problems, and there are also different spheres of acting. So no general answer to your question, which is a tough one, yeah.
Last but not least, because I just realized, we are close to running over time, and that's not an apology for not being answering your question, maybe later, but I think Andre Zwitter might have the perfect solution to all our problems in 1 minute.
No, I don't at all. But,
Too bad.
But I have one thing that came to mind when you say we are all consequentialist, and what does it then mean when it kind of hits the practical, right? There is a very tiny piece in St. Augustine's Civitas Dei, and it's about phronesis, right? And he is confronted with the question, what if you are in a situation where there is no right choice? And what he says is, then somewhere in your prior decision you've made the wrong choice.
Well, thank you all for joining us today, and be compassionate, hug each other, and become philosophers. Thank you.